Hi everyone, hope you're all doing great. My name is Elitsa and I'm a software developer at the CMS team, currently only part-time as I'm taking my master's degree at a university here in Denmark. Apart from that, I come from Bulgaria and 5 years ago I decided to move to Denmark for studying. That's a little bit about me. Let me pass the mic to my colleague.
Yep, my name is Bjarke Berg. I am a senior developer on the CMS team at Umbraco HQ, and I'm also the project lead on the migration project. So welcome to our talk about Umbraco 9, the next major version of Umbraco. And just to make it clear, we will use the term .NET Core to differentiate clearly from .NET Framework, even that it is now officially just .NET. First, we need to talk about the motivation for making Umbraco 9, with the main goal to update the backend technologies to .NET Core. First of all, the .NET Framework is end of life and there won't come any more new versions. So this change also opens up for using Umbraco on other platforms. We know that many developers use Mac today and they all need to run Umbraco through a virtual machine. This opens up for easier development and hosting on other platforms. .NET Core and the new web framework in particular have some super cool and important performance improvements. And finally, we want to avoid having legacy technologies that newly educated developers haven't learned during their education. Some of the goals of the project is we want to adopt the best practices from .NET Core. We want to avoid having backend technologies all out of date, so all of our backend technologies need to be up to date. Now we are doing a big migration anyway. It's important from Umbraco HQ to have community involvement, so it's not just HQ pointing the direction. We really want feedback. And finally, we want to make the migration as easy as possible. This final point kind of pointed in a different direction, so it's all about finding a good balance. But as an example, we try to keep the client code untouched. Regarding community involvement, we have introduced a community team called the Unicore Team. The team is a good mix of different kind of stakeholders, some with more hard programming skills and other with other focus like business. The team currently consists of me, and then we have Simone Gerarde, Steve Temple, Benjamin Kaleski, and Emma Garland. The team helps other community members by answering posts in the forum or on Twitter, help migrating the code base, and also act as a sounding board so we can discuss all kind of changes.
All right. The biggest change, without a doubt, is the new web framework developed by Microsoft. It is still called ASP.NET Core, even though the full framework is now renamed to just .NET, as Bjarke already said. The first thing that you would notice is the new project structure. On the slide, you can see the comparison through the two images. The one that's a little higher up shows the file structure of an ASP.NET MVC website, which is running on .NET Framework. On the bottom one, you can see an ASP.NET Core MVC project, much smaller, right? So, with ASP.NET Core, the project file itself has changed. The CS proj is now required to use the new SDK format, which was also available in .NET Framework, but is not the default one. One great benefit is that the NuGet dependencies are listed inside the project file. And this saves us from having a separate packages config, for example. Plus, you don't have to list all the files in your structure anymore, which leads to fewer merge conflicts on active projects. The new big change is that there are less folders. This is because of the new VVV folder. It contains all the files that need to be accessible from the browser, as opposed to the old framework, where files were available by default unless they were located in app data. You can configure other sources that should be accessible from the browser as well, but we'll talk about this a little later. Next, you'll most likely notice that webconfig and global SIX are gone. Our configuration is now located in app settings file, and we'll dive into this later. Regarding global SIX, the program.cs file is an entry point to your application. Inside this file, we have a static main method, as we know from console apps and other program languages too. let's talk about the web server. As part of the journey towards cross-platform support, the new web framework is no longer tightly coupled to IIS. Instead, it ships with a built-in lightweight web server called Kestrel. It's not recommended to use it directly on public-facing websites though, just like most Umbraco solutions. The recommendation is to have a reverse proxy in front like IIS, Nginx, or Apache. But on Windows, Microsoft has made it possible to run Kestrel in process of IIS to speed things a little. Then we have to talk about HttpContext because it has been completely rewritten in the new web framework. Many web developers find it a nightmare to write unit tests that required the use of HTTP context. Therefore, Microsoft decided to re-implement the HTTP context from scratch. Now, we have a lightweight HTTP context that has a smaller memory footprint for each request. This is one of the reasons for the much better performance. Another great benefit is that the new implementation is made with testability in mind. We can now easily write unit tests that involve HTTP context. Now, with ASP.NET Core, we have an aligned web stack. In the old framework, we were used to having two concepts, one for MVC websites and another one for web APIs. Even though those two were almost the same, most classes had to be duplicated with small changes like filters, controllers, etc. Now there is just a single implementation that handles both. This is very valuable for an application like Umbraco because we use both concepts. The new request pipeline is awesome because the order in which the code is executed has been made very clear. The pipeline is heavily inspired by the Owen project, and we now use middlewares. When a request is made, some code will be executed in the first middleware. That middleware will determine whether or not to call the next middleware, and so on. If a middleware can handle this request, for example, a static file middleware, if it finds a file for that request, it can just return, but otherwise it will call the next middleware. So ordering is important. Static file middleware needs to execute before another middleware that can handle that request too, like MVC. By the end, the middlewares traverse back. So for the first middleware, it will typically be some kind of error handling to ensure that all the errors that happen in the following middlewares are caught. The pipelines can be set up in the new startup.cs file that we talked about before. Now, Dependency Injection is a first-class citizen. The web framework contains a simple DI container that can be registered with several other containers as they all use the same common abstraction. Umbraco simply relies on the native container. All framework services are available from this container, so you can just inject all the dependencies that you need almost anywhere, views, filters, or areas where it wasn't possible in the old framework. Finally, there are also some new features available, of course. As we just mentioned, due to DI, we can now inject dependencies directly into views using the Razor keyword @inject. Next, a new feature called tag helpers has been introduced. They're used as an alternative to HTML helper. You can now create your own HTML tags or attributes, and they'll be executed on the server and manipulate the content before the HTML is rendered to your client. Then we have the new concept called view components. Basically, they are the same as controllers, but without all the routing parts. They can be used for reusable components inside the views, therefore replacing the child-only actions. Finally, we can use all the latest features from the language itself, C#, like records.
Yep, let's take a look at what's been changed in Umbraco so we have a better idea what it takes to upgrade or migrate from Umbraco 8. The first thing to notice is we have removed the last remains of web forms. So before, the page that is shown when Umbraco is empty was implemented in web forms. This has now been migrated to MVC. Also macros have been cleaned for references. Due to the changes in the project format, the new SDK format, there are some changes to NuGet packages. We can't just copy content to the solution out of the box, and we can't execute a script like the install.ps1 when a package is installed or updated. Instead, we have to use target files, which contains MS build targets, so we can now do something before build and before clean, like copying content into a solution or cleaning the content. A side effect of the new SDK format is that most NuGet packages only contain one assembly. To make it easy for you, we have introduced a meta package, which is basically just an empty package that has dependencies to all the packages you need. So now you can just rely on Umbraco.cms. Also, System.Web is gone as a rule of thumb. So everything has been replaced by either System.net, which is net standard, or by the new web framework and there's NuGet packages. We also had some static classes that had third-party dependencies. These have all been changed due to dependency injection. So now we inject hosting environment instead of using a static hosting environment. Now we inject IO helper instead of using a static IO helper, and so on for Umbraco version, typefinder, and so on. Note that some of these change per scope or per request. So for these, you will need to inject an Umbraco context accessor to get the Umbraco context. This is the same pattern as Microsoft used for the HTTP context. And you need to do it this way because all services in general are registered as singletons. We also had some incompatible dependencies. Client dependency is now replaced by Smidge. Both are created and managed by Shannon Dominic from Umbraco HQ. Image processor has been replaced by Image Sharp. Both are created and managed by James Jackson South. We also have a dependency on Lucene.net version 2 through Examine. This has now been replaced or updated to the latest version, Lucene.net 4, which is net standard compatible. Due to the changes in the NuGet package manager, we can't just install Umbraco in an empty web project anymore by installing the package. Instead, a new concept called .NET New Templates is introduced as part of .NET Core. By default, Microsoft shipped all their templates in the new format, and Visual Studio and Writer does support these templates together with the CLI. We have added 2 such templates, one for creating an empty Umbraco project and one for creating an Umbraco package. And these images show how it looks in the CLI and in Visual Studio or Writer. The empty Umbraco project is comparable to what you did in Framework by installing Umbraco NuGet packages into an empty web project. Also, we have updated all namespaces to be located under Umbraco.cms, except public extension methods that are all now located in Umbraco.extensions to make them very easy discoverable. All other namespaces now also reflect the new internal structure, so Umbraco.cms.core or whatever, if it's part of the core assembly. Because we now inject all of our dependencies instead of relying on static references or the service locator anti-pattern, we had to change most constructors. The good thing is this is handled by the container if you're using DI, which you are in ASP.NET Core. But note that if you have to implement your own class and use one of our classes as a base class, you will most likely have to implement a constructor that can pass all the new dependencies to our base class. And of course your IDE can help with that. We have migrated both users and members authentication to ASP.NET Core Identity. Users were implemented using ASP.NET Identity in Umbraco 8, so this is fairly simple. Members were implemented using an even older technology called membership providers, so here it now works more like users do. And in general, we try to use the best practices from the .NET Core world, and some of these things are to use Microsoft's common abstractions. So instead of relying on our own abstractions for logging and dependency injection and so on, we rely on Microsoft abstractions. These abstractions are implemented by a handful of providers, so you can still use specific logging framework, if you would. We are using Serilog under the hood. Also, configuration and option pattern are changed.
Let's take a deeper dive into configuration and the new options pattern. This will most likely be the part that you think has changed the most. It will take some time to understand, but when you know all the concepts, it's really intuitive and simple to work with, plus quite powerful. Regarding configuration, we need to start thinking in a completely different way. We were used to reading from one single XML file, basically, which was transformed to have the correct values for each environment. This is not the case anymore. Now configurations are read from multiple read-only sources instead. Sources with a higher priority will then override existing values. It is important to note that sources and priorities can be configured outside of Umbraco, and we don't force any specific sources or priorities either. If you're using our templates or using the Microsoft's default web templates, the ordering of sources and priorities is the following. First, values are read from the app settings JSON file. Then values are overwritten by what also exists in app settings.environment JSON file, where environment is replaced by production by default, but development in your development environment. Next, and only if the environment is development, values are read from user secrets. This is the recommended place for storing sensitive data like passwords. Further on, we read from environment variables. This is now the recommended place for sensitive data in production. Finally, and therefore with the highest priority, configuration values can be provided via the command line while starting the application. By default, there are many possible configuration providers available: JSON, XML, Azure Key Vault, command line, memory, and the list goes further on, as you can see on the slide. Or you can quite easily implement your own providers as well. Here we have a simple example of how iConfiguration can be used. We have set up some configuration in app settings JSON in the upper left corner, a section named My Section with two keys, my bool value being true and my string value being hello world. There is also an environment variable with the value override from environment variable, as you can see. Note that with environment variables, you need to use double underscores to indicate a section. On the right side, we have a class with two properties. We can inject iConfiguration into the class and call getSection to read values. The type can also be specified as a generic value, and the key to the configuration will also be needed. Here, the sections are separated by a column. Using the default sources and priorities, the values will end up being my bool value, true, and my string value override from environment variable. There are some downsides of using configuration directly. First of all, this leads to duplicate code. As you saw, we have to type the keys to the configuration values multiple times. And the naming is also pretty fragile because of the use of magic strings. To avoid this, we have the new options pattern. The options pattern uses plain old C# objects known as POCOs to provide strongly typed access to groups of related settings. The POCOs can be wrapped in 3 different option interfaces and injected into your code. This is the configuration relevant only to your code, to your class, so you can use the single responsibility principle there. With iConfiguration, the values will be cached, and because iOptions, I meant iOptions, the value will be cached, and because of iOptions interface, because it is registered in the container as singleton, the first time you read it, it will be that value for the entire application lifetime. Because iOptions snapshot is registered as scope, it will only be cached for the rest of the request. And finally, iOptions monitor is registered as a singleton, but it evaluates the value on each call. Options can be configured in a number of different ways. You can configure the values using code. This would be a simple way to override some values from Umbraco based on some other values. We can use configuration, as we just saw, and this option can be validated using the validation attribute or other complex validation of values. Like the priority of sources, the ordering here is super important. It is possible to use post-configure method, so you can ensure your configuration is executed as the last thing. Here is a simple example that shows how we can configure options in code. The Models Builder settings POCU will be updated, and the value from Models directory will use the value of mode. This is something we can't do using configuration files. That is, use one configuration value as part of another one. But if you ask us, the real power comes when iConfiguration and the options pattern are combined. In this example, the options are configured with the values from the config first and later overwritten in code. Using this configuration, we only have to hardcode the string mySection once. From this point in time, we can inject the POCU wrapped in one of the three option interfaces into your code, even if it is required in views. Imagine you can override all the configurations that are set by Umbraco or package or any package using this technique. Moreover, you often find that a package just uses the iOptions pattern and not configuration. But this won't be a problem because you can easily add your own bindings and thereby allow configuration in JSON files, for example. If you need more information on this topic, you can use Pluralsight and follow the talk code using configuration and options in .NET Core and ASP.NET Core apps by Steve Gordon. And of course, Microsoft provides pretty good official documentation in this area as well.
Yes, another thing that has changed to the better are events. So Umbraco no longer raises plain old C# events. Instead, we now publish notifications. These notifications are heavily inspired by the Mediator project. Now we can use dependency injection very easy, and we can support async notifications. And the best part, in my opinion, is they're not tightly coupled to any specific implementations anymore. So if we look at some code, here I have introduced an extension method on iUmbraco Builder, so this can be used from the startup class. It basically just called two other extension methods on this builder. One to add a notification handler for the content saving notification called mySync content saving handler, and another one for an async handler. And below you can see how to implement these handlers. So basically you implement an interface and specify the notification type, and then you are forced to implement the handle method where you have the notification accessible or available. And if you want to use our templates or our pattern for this, instead of relying on C# events yourself in your package or in your custom code, this is how to do it. So basically here I have my class where I inject iEvent aggregator and save it in a field, and then I have two methods, one sync and one async, and I can call the event aggregator.publish or event aggregator.publish async and just new up the notification. And below is shown the most simple notification possible. Of course, here you can just add information you want to provide to the handlers in the constructor and save it in the event.
All right, time to talk about packages. With V9, we try to make it as easy as possible to migrate packages. However, from now on, we'll only support NuGet installs for packages. The packages section in the back office will remain, and only packages with NuGet feeds registered will be shown. We might change the name to something like Marketplace, for example. Discontinuing the original way of distributing Umbraco packages in some aspects at least is a good thing. It will prevent editors from installing packages in production and therefore avoid the risk of installing something that can break the site. We also ensure that all site dependencies are in source control. Additionally, we'll continue to use the data from our Umbraco to feed the packages list in the backoffice. Apart from that, there are still changes related to transitioning from .NET Framework to .NET Core, but more on that on the next slide. The docs for extending Umbraco haven't changed much, meaning that there'll be no issues in the core part of your implementation content-wise. You'll also be able to continue working with app plugins, package manifest, and static files. And now, how can you actually create or update a package to work with Umbraco 9? To mention again, there is a new template targeting packages called Umbraco package. It is an empty package with package manifest and targets file ready for you. There are different Umbraco NuGet packages to reference, depending on whether your package is an extension to the website part, the backoffice part, or both. You of course need to write or migrate the package code base to .NET. .NET Pack can be used to create a package for Umbraco that is distributed through NuGet. Additionally, you can use our Umbraco project template together with the Umbraco package one to create a test site. It will automatically add a project dependency to, for example, my custom Umbraco package and import a target file for that project, thus emulating a NuGet package reference. So in short, the main changes are due to NuGet. The non-compiled assets like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript will be included in the generated NuGet package, and importantly, they will be restored to the required location when the package is installed.
Yep, now we have talked enough about what has changed. Let's also look at all the things that are still the same as you know it from Umbraco 8. So the most important thing that is still as you know it is the database schema. Unlike the migration from Umbraco 7 to 8, you will not need to migrate any content this time. The changes to the database schema is no bigger than between minor versions of Umbraco 8. Another major part of Umbraco 8 that is generally unchanged in Umbraco 9 is all the client code. So there are a few exceptions. So members had to make small changes due to the ASP.NET Core identity implementation. And for enums, we are now aligned, so we are always serializing as strings instead of sometimes as integers and sometimes as strings. And finally, health checks had to change due to the new configuration system that is read-only. We can't change your configuration values programmatically. Instead, we can point to some documentation about how to do it, and then you need to fix it yourself. But the good thing is, then all your changes will be part of your source control too. Another area that would look like you know it from Umbraco 8 is in views. So iPublish content is still injected into the views. All models builder models implement iPublish content. All the extension methods you used to use is still there, like value, URL, children, descendants, ancestors, and so on. Even that some of these extension methods under the hood uses services to get the data, these are still available. But we also made the overloads available so you can inject these services and thereby make your code even more testable and maybe even show your developers which extension methods that are maybe not that cheap to call in all cases. Models Builder is still available in the embedded version that also ships with Umbraco 8. We have renamed the modes, even that the functionality is the same. But now the names are better aligned with .NET Core. And composers and components are still there. In your components, we now inject Umbraco Builder, like you know it from the startup file. And from there on, you can get the service collection, so you can use all the extension methods from NuGet packages or our own, like add notification. As we already mentioned, the app plugin folder is still the location for your extension parts. We have registered it as a second VVRE folder, so everything inside that folder is now by default accessible from the browser. It is the same package manifest file. Umbraco 8 packages without a DLL can in theory be added directly to Umbraco 9. In general, all concepts still exist, so surface controls, renders controls, route hijacking, but keep in mind that We have an aligned web stack now, so we don't have a render MVC controller anymore, because you can just use the render controller.
All right, this is a good time to take a breath. This last part is about the release candidate of Umbraco 9, which we aim to make available sometime in July. As you know, we have shipped several alphas, betas, and now is the point in time where Forms Deploy and Starter Kit will be available. When is the final release, you may ask? Our aim is at the end of August this year, where support in Umbraco Cloud and final documentation will be ready. So you might be watching us, nodding, grasping all the info that we are sharing with you. Think that it all makes sense to me, so let me put it on my to-do list for now. I'll take a couple of months to look into .NET, try it out, get comfortable, and then I'll try Umbraco 9. But it will never be the right time. So open your laptop, try it out, even go for a new client and do a demo. Migrating to Umbraco 9 will make your dev team so much happier. No more VMs, no more computers overheating. They will be able to do their job in the OS they prefer the most. Help us by testing it out. Discovering flaws that we can fix early on will give you confidence that you'll be in total control in your next client demo. We can easily change things at this moment. The next 2 months is the period where you won't need to wait weeks until the next batch or major. Once you have the final release, you can have all the discovered flaws addressed. Hope we managed to motivate you to go directly and try Umbraco 9, but it's now time to say goodbye. We had a great time telling you all about the next major version of Umbraco, and we hope you enjoyed it as well. Thank you for attending, and see you soon.